That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Those famous words spoken on July 20th, 1969 as the Apollo 11 team set foot on the moon rang worldwide for all to hear. Americans sat in front of their television screens, marveling at the greatness of their country and their fellow man. We had done what seemed to be impossible. We had passed the confines of what had been our home since we came into existence, and now even the vast expanse of the universe seemed within our grasp. People were captivated. They were absolutely in awe of what America had just achieved. And they had done it just in time. The space race was over. America had crossed the finish line. It had beaten its longtime foe, proving once and for all that its technology was superior to that of the Soviet Union. But in the years since, people have begun to ask questions. People watched the broadcast, but a few things didn't add up. These questions turned into beliefs that the broadcast itself was a complete fraud. One man even irately badgered one of the astronauts on the crew of Apollo 11 with these accusations until he was punched in the face. People began to call the astronauts and the American government liars, saying that Apollo 11 never even landed on the moon. Conspiracy theorists said that the world had been lied to. But why? To beat the Soviet Union, of course. So join me today as we explore why people think that the moon landing may have been faked. This video is going to be chock full of evidence. This video is going to be chock full of resources. This isn't a fluff piece. We are diving deep into why people think that the moon landing was faked. So if you've ever been on the edge about this whole issue, I know where I stand personally on the whole thing, but I highly recommend you watch this video with an open mind because there are just some bizarre inconsistencies here throughout the whole official story that we're going to talk about them in a second. As always with this show, all the resources that I'm using are going to be posted in a document in the description of this episode. All parties are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law, and I'm not planning on doing anything to myself in the near future. I'm definitely not going anywhere, and I'm definitely not planning on disappearing. But without further ado, thank you for joining me today, and welcome to the Conspiracy Files. Today's video was brought to you by June's Journey. So oftentimes late at night, I find myself lying wide awake in bed. It's kind of hard to turn your brain off after a full day of researching stories like the one we're talking about today. But I've completely found relaxation in the game June's Journey. June's Journey is a hidden object mystery game with a captivating detective story taking you all the way back to the Roaring '20s, with a large and mysterious cast of characters. In the game June's Journey, you play as June Parker, an amateur detective on a quest to solve her own sister's murder. Now, I've played a lot of games on mobile. I'm a gamer myself, and Courtney, my wife, and I actually both love June's Journey. We've worked with these guys in the past, and they actually asked to sponsor some of our content after I had started playing the game. So I've had a long journey with this game, and it is indeed incredibly fun and fulfilling too. In the game, you search for hidden objects and clues, trying to decipher this mystery amidst some really beautiful landscapes. That's something that I love about the game, the way that the worlds are designed, the scenes are set in the game. It really immerses you in the experience. So if you're looking for a way to kill time and keep your brain active, June's Journey is definitely the way to go. So if you want to get started and help solve this mystery, download June's Journey today for free by clicking the link below in the description or by scanning the QR code that's on the screen. June's Journey is available on Android and iOS devices, as well as on PC through Facebook Games. Once again, June's Journey, it's a very, very fun game. I would scan the QR code and give it a try. But without further ado, let's get back into our story. So, the moon landing, everybody. This has been a highly requested episode, an episode I've been sitting on for a while, and this is going to be a very, very polarizing episode. I know people in my life who are 1,000,000% convinced that the moon landing was faked. I also know people who will fight you to the bone, claiming that it wasn't fake and that, obviously, why would you believe that the government would do this and yada, yada, yada. I'm in the camp where I think there's too much fishiness involved with the story to not have some sort of, darker history behind it. You're going to see why in a little bit. There's so many coincidences and so many facts that just don't line up, but I'm not going to push you to any direction here, guys. You can believe in whatever you would like to believe. Obviously, here on the show, I only present stories if I have facts and resources to back them up. This isn't a channel that exists on conjecture and assertions that are false without evidence. So everything that I talk about, I'm going to be providing the resources in a document. This script was researched and written by Sabrin Chandler Lewis. Sabrin has been such a massive help to the show, and I want to give her a shout out for the contribution to this episode. It takes a lot of work to make this show happen, guys. we have a whole team. We have writers and researchers and editors. So yeah, I'm just really proud of everybody here, and I'm really thankful that we've built the audience that we have online. I know a lot of people have asked for this episode, so I hope that we can do you guys proud. But yeah, this is like one of the most classic conspiracy theories ever. And I do want to state, first of all, this channel is called the Conspiracy Files, right? And I've had a lot of people say, oh, you shouldn't have called it the Conspiracy Files because it's all true. It's not a conspiracy. And that's the whole point of what I'm doing. It's taking back the word, because conspiracy theory, that whole, word and term generated after the assassination of JFK by intelligence officers in the United States to make people seem, less legitimate when they brought up the JFK assassination. By the way, if you want me to release that episode, please tell me, because I've got a 65-page script ready to go. It's like the deepest dive into the JFK assassination you could possibly wish for. But yeah, I'm hoping to show people that these things that we talk about here are labeled conspiracies, and they are conspiracies. It just takes two or more people coming together for, with a dark goal in mind to create a conspiracy. But these things are legit, especially with and people have come at me said, why do you talk about so much, and why do you try to expose these people? You must be one yourself. I just got another comment today, some jackass saying, this guy probably just makes these videos so that he can research this sick stuff. No, I care about informing people, educating people, and I really want to raise awareness with this channel. My biggest passion nowadays is exposing these criminals that have been allowed to roam free and have escaped prosecution, criminals that have committed crimes against children. So that's been a main focus of my work here on the channel, and illustrating to you how all of these webs are connected to each other. So it's like a 20-part documentary series, and each one you start hearing the same names over and over again, and you realize none of these people have been convicted of the crimes that they committed. So yeah, that's my little tirade there. But without further ado, let's just get into this story. Why did we want to go to the moon? Well, after World War II, the United States and Britain formed an uneasy alliance against the Soviet Union. The US and Britain feared the Soviets having a permanent dominion over Eastern Europe, and feared that the Soviets were spreading communism throughout Western Europe. The Cold War, which ran from 1947 to 1990, solidified when the US provided aid to Western Europe through the Marshall Plan and brought the countries under the American influence, thus opposing communist influence. During the Cold War, especially in the beginning, mass fear of communism ran rampant throughout the United States. McCarthyism, which was like the Red Scare of the early 20th century, caused many government officials to lose their jobs or become blacklisted, simply because it was feared that they themselves had ties to communism or communist regimes. During this time, the United States had demonstrated the horrific power of the nuclear bomb, and the Soviet Union began to try to catch up. On August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union completed its first successful nuclear weapons test in Kazakhstan. Meanwhile, the US intelligence assessments had placed them as being 3 years away from having access to such technology. So the Soviets were growing stronger and deadlier quicker than United States intelligence officials thought they had been. And both countries believed that powerful bombs large enough to wipe out thousands of people with a single explosion were the future of warfare. Therefore, a race began between the two entities to create the next class of weapons, thermonuclear or hydrogen bombs. This began what was known as the nuclear arms race. The US obviously got there first, detonating a hydrogen bomb at an atoll in the Marshall Islands in late 1952. Its second test in 1954 was badly miscalculated and created a radioactive fallout that harmed many inhabitants of the Marshall Islands. In fact, we are going to talk about that later on another episode, because that's a whole nother thing the United States government has covered up, and obviously the US government has completely over the indigenous people, not only of the US, but of all the sovereign, territories that we've asserted dominance over. But that story is just bananas if you want to look it up in the meantime. But back to these bombs. The Soviet Union tested its first thermonuclear device in November of 1955. Their device also had devastating impacts on the residents of Kazakhstan. Eventually, safeguards were set to protect civilians in the wake of this power conflict, and the space race began soon afterwards in October of 1957. At that time, the Soviet Union had just conducted the first successful test of an ICBM, or intercontinental ballistic missile, in the world. It was seen as capable of striking US territory, and days later, the modified rocket launched the first man-made satellite, Sputnik 1, into orbit. The rapid growth of Soviet technology gave rise to the fear of a strike on US soil and the militarization of space. The first US ICBM, Atlas, made its first flight in late 1958. That same year, the US government created NASA, meant to be a civilian space exploration agency. When it began, the space race had no finish line. No set endpoint would mean that either entity had won. Both countries were simply seeing who could create the next best technology. President John F. Kennedy was the first to propose a finish line. He proclaimed that America should commit itself to going to the moon when he stood before Congress on May 25, 1961. Then, President Kennedy gave a speech at Rice University on September 12, 1962. In it, he stated that he promised to land a man on the moon before 1970. The objective was to get there before the Soviets, and thus we get to the real meat and potatoes of the space race. Before man ever stepped foot on the moon, the space race was decided by firsts, such as the first satellite, the first man and woman in space, and the first spacewalk. All of these were first achieved by the Soviet Union. The US drove itself hard playing catch-up, trying to get on an even playing field with the Soviets. Preceding the manned space missions, Sputnik 2 was launched into space on November 3, 1957, carrying one passenger to study the effects of living creatures in space. Laika the dog was sent into space, and sadly, no provisions were made to recover her. She was a part Samoyed stray picked up off the streets of Moscow, and the Soviet scientists chose her specifically as they thought a homeless dog would be better equipped for the cold, hunger, and harsh conditions of space. It's likely that Laika only survived a few hours after reaching orbit, and on April 14, 1958, Sputnik 2 fell back into the atmosphere and burned up on re-entry. After 3 years, the Soviets orbited more animals, returning the crews safely to Earth to prepare for human spaceflight. At least 10 other dogs were launched on orbital flights before the first human-manned mission to space, with most of those dogs returning home alive. Yuri Gagarin was the first human in space, a Soviet to the disappointment of Americans. He circled the Earth in Vostok 1 on April 12, 1961, at a rate of 27,400 kilometers per hour, with the flight lasting a total of 108 minutes. American astronaut Alan Shepard came shortly afterwards aboard the Freedom 7 capsule, made only large enough for one person. The flight did not orbit Earth and only reached 116 miles into the atmosphere before landing in the Atlantic Ocean. The first woman in space came 2 years later, with Soviet cosmonaut Valentina Tereshkova orbiting the Earth on June 16, 1963, a part of the Vostok 6 mission. On March 18, 1965, Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov performed the first spacewalk. It lasted 12 minutes and 9 seconds as he free-floated outside of the Voskhod 2 spacecraft. Meanwhile, the early efforts of the United States were marked with failures. They attempted to use the Navy rocket Vanguard, yet it exploded at launch, and the media of the time was heavily critical. President Kennedy was eager to take the lead over the Soviets, and Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson conducted a poll with leaders and multiple sources such as the military and NASA, and his findings reported that, quote, with a strong effort, the US could conceivably beat the Soviet Union by sending a man to the moon. Neither the US nor the Soviet Union had a rocket that could perform a mission of that magnitude. But with the many successes of the Soviets, the US began at a disadvantage. At the time of Kennedy's announcement to Congress, the total space time of an American, Alan Shepard, aboard the Freedom 7 capsule was barely 15 minutes. Many more firsts needed to be made before man could set foot on the moon, and the Soviets, like I said before, beat the US in many. It seemed that the US was still losing the space race, but the United States was following a program that they believed would build upon itself and extend beyond all previous tests. The American Mercury missions developed the hardware needed for safe spaceflight and return. The object was to show how human beings would fare in the harsh conditions of space. Throughout 1961 and 1963, the US flew multiple test flights and 6 manned missions. After Mercury, crews of 10 flew Gemini missions. The Gemini spacecraft was redesigned, large enough for 2 astronauts. These missions flew from 1964 to 1966, improving spacecraft control, rendezvous, and docking, and then finally, spacewalking. One of the 2 Gemini missions lasted 2 weeks in space, long enough for future crews to land on the moon, explore the moon, and return. In 1967, though, the space race began to prove deadly for man. In January of that year, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee died after a fire ignited in the Apollo 1 capsule on the launch pad. A few months later, Soviet cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov was killed when the parachute on his spacecraft, the Soyuz 1, failed to open on re-entry. The US finally achieved a significant goal when Apollo 8 became the first human-crewed spacecraft to reach the moon and orbit it, then successfully return to Earth. Then 1 year later, on July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first men to walk on the surface of the moon, while crewmate Michael Collins orbited on Apollo 11. The televised landing was witnessed by 723 million people worldwide. The spacecraft Eagle landed on the region of the moon known as the Sea of Tranquility, with the famous radio message, "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." Then the famous words rang across the world, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Now, that's the official story, right? According to everybody, that's the truth of the space landing. Afterwards, Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, they all came back to the Earth. There were more missions that went to the moon, space flights, and space travel has advanced significantly. And yeah, I guess that's it. That's the end of the podcast, guys. Time to shut up. Or at least that's what they want you to believe. Because now we have to talk about the conspiracy. Nationalism burned in the hearts of many Americans during this time. They were proud of their country and what they had achieved. People looked at America as a powerhouse, once again, instead of an embarrassment for their failures early in the space race. So why, today, do so many people have doubts that all of it was real? Why did Bart Sibrel get punched by Buzz Aldrin after calling him a coward and a liar? Where did this all begin? Well, it began in 1976 with the book We Never Went to the Moon, America's $30 billion swindle. The book was written by former U.S. Navy officer Bill Kaysing, who worked as a technical writer for a rocket manufacturer who worked on NASA's Apollo missions. Bill claimed to have inside knowledge of a government conspiracy that faked the moon landings. His claims detailed a massive government scheme to fake a moon landing so that the US could publicly beat the Soviet Union in the space race. Because I mean, once you're on the moon, there's no other goal to really achieve. You can't really move those goalposts. Once you're on the moon, you're the first one on the moon, you've kind of won, I guess. Kaysing's theory was that NASA couldn't safely land a man on the moon by the end of the 60s as Kennedy had promised, and their only achievement had been sending a man into orbit. Then, theorists alleged that NASA staged the moon landing in a film studio, resulting in many signs that the footage and photos were falsified. Theorists claim that you don't have to be an expert on the moon landing to see that this stuff looks a little suspicious or fishy. Is it plausible? Well, we already know that the US was leagues behind the Soviets at every turn in the conflict, and that American pride was beginning to dwindle as the media slammed the government for its ineffectual steps to win the space race. But could they really have taken such drastic steps to win the race, to improve American morale, and to make a show of strength for the United States? Well, the US obviously already had a long and historical history of shady moves, one being the U-2 spy plane scandal in the 60s. President Eisenhower had told NASA to say that a civilian plane was missing, but the Soviets had captured the pilot of the missing plane, and the pilot had confessed to them that the plane had been used to spy on the Soviets. Only when confronted by the truth did Eisenhower confess openly that the U-2 was indeed a spy plane. This was one of the first times that the American people learned that their leaders weren't always being truthful, and the American people were absolutely devastated. With this event and many events after the moon landing where it was proven that the American government was willing to lie to protect its interests, it's plausible that they could create an even bigger lie when the stakes were as high as they were in the 1960s. You see, President Kennedy had made a promise, and to fail at that promise would make the American government and its people look foolish. They couldn't stand to be seen as weak for failing to beat the Soviets yet again. And remember, President Kennedy was assassinated after he made that promise. So I'm sure a lot of people in the government and in the United States at the time wanted to honor one of Kennedy's final promises that he had made before he was gunned down. And with that simple fact, the groundwork is laid for the idea that the government of the United States had forged a plan to defeat the Soviets in the space race, once and for all proving American superiority, and the superiority of democracy over communism. The Kaysing version of the conspiracy took root in the 1970s, after more government distrust built over the Pentagon Papers, which proved that the Johnson administration had systematically lied to the American people about the Vietnam War. Not only that, but the Watergate scandal of Nixon's administration was also nightly news. Americans were poised to question their government because of these events. So when Kaysing's theory was released, he had a wide and attentive audience. The tide had turned from the external threat of communism to the internal threat of a government poised to conspire against its own citizens. With the assassination of John F. Kennedy, which was widely believed to have been a plot by the government after the conclusion of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, theorists took a new route to understanding and finding the truth. They used publicly available information and began to reinterpret it, forming a different story than what they had been previously told. Before, they simply believed in suppressed evidence. Now they were looking at what truth lay inside evidence that had already been released to the public. They made the most use of what they could physically see. They couldn't be lied to by their own eyes. And this is what gave the original conspiracy of the moon landing footage so much credence. Later theories made against NASA by the Flat Earth Society stated that Hollywood and Disney faked the footage, using a script by Arthur C. Clarke and film direction by Stanley Kubrick. But what evidence suggests that this was the truth? Most of the original claims made against the moon landing lie within the original footage and photos taken. One such image shows astronaut Neil Armstrong's shadow next to the shadow of another object. The issue with this photo is that the shadows are not parallel, but why should they be? Theorists claim that if the sun was the only light source, the shadows should be parallel. However, experts have claimed to have debunked this theory because of the perspective of the photo. The debunk states that since it is a three-dimensional situation reduced to a two-dimensional plane, the lines may do many strange things that don't line up with what we think we should see. The second theory is much more scientific, that the astronauts should not have survived the radiation field that surrounds our planet. The Van Allen radiation belt surrounds the Earth, which is a zone in the magnetic field where high-energy trapped particles from the sun are confined. Theorists state that the high amount of radiation should have killed the astronauts when they passed through this belt, but one professor had a reply that seemingly put the theory to bed: firewalking. Professor Oha of the National Space Center states that similar to firewalking, as long as the astronauts were not subjected to the radiation for too long, they wouldn't have been killed. He states that the astronauts were not in the Van Allen radiation belt long enough to have sustained any permanent or lasting damage. However, the astronauts were technically in the belt for around 3 hours, receiving about 1.8 sieverts, a representation of the stochastic health risk of ionizing radiation. Exposure to more than 1 sievert leads to fatal injuries. So it's been documented that exposure to over 1 sievert of this radiation can damage a person, and it can hit someone with fatal injuries. And the astronauts that were in that belt for 3 hours should have been exposed to 1.8 sieverts. So 2 times the amount of radiation that would lead to a fatal injury. Strange, right? The amount of radiation that the astronauts were exposed to should have at least led to nausea and vomiting. It could have led to 20% mortality and bone marrow changes, but it never did. So why did the astronauts not develop cancer, die prematurely, or show any ill effects from the radiation? In the same breath, many question the spacesuits used by the astronauts, saying that they could not have survived the radiation because they weren't accurately protected. The radiation should have killed them straight off, or at least should have caused cancers or other health defects. Measurements were taken of the astronauts' skin after their landing, and they read at about 0.18 rad, which matched radiation readings taken from missions that were restricted to low Earth orbit. So, because of this, many theorists began to claim that the Apollo 11 crew had only made it into orbit, and they then came back down. It is interesting. Here you have the radiation level measured on the astronaut's skin, matching the same levels that were read on other astronauts' skin after they had done these low Earth orbit missions. And they supposedly passed through this intense radiation belt, and that had not caused a significant spike on the radiation that was, measured on their skin. They were in that belt for 3 hours. So that's something people question all the time. The aluminum shielding on the Apollo spacecraft also only amounted to a wall of lead about 7 millimeters thick. The spacesuits used by the astronauts didn't contain any lead, which is the standard material used during X-rays to protect patients from radiation. However, lead proved resistant to motion, so they used different materials. Aluminum, Teflon, and titanium were used in the spacesuits to protect the astronauts. But it's a known fact that aluminum can't effectively shield against gamma or neutron rays. In the thickness range for space applications, biological data indicates that aluminum or aluminum alloy structures may create unhealthy internal spacecraft environments in the thickness range for space applications. Therefore, scientific evidence tells us that health-related challenges of travel into deep space are unsolved, rendering manned moon missions and beyond impossible. What other proof exists that the moon landing was staged? Well, people asked questions about why the sky in the footage had no stars. They said that with the absence of atmospheric distortion and clouds, there should have been stars in the image. And in fact, there are no stars in any of the images or video. Theorists claim that since NASA couldn't fake the sky's multitude of stars accurately, they just chose to not include the stars at all. But one popular debunking of that theory lies in the fact that the lunar landscape was brightly lit by the sun, and that it was daytime on the moon when the photos were captured. So, just like on Earth during the day, we wouldn't be able to see the stars. While this may be dismissible, many ask why the American flag that was placed on the moon waved in what seemed to be wind. The flag shouldn't have moved at all, and its waving has caused many questions. One of the answers that people were given was a horizontal telescoping arm or a crossbar on top of the flag that held it aloft. It wasn't fully extended by the early astronauts, and the movement was caused by Buzz Aldrin twisting the flag into the ground. So why can't we see the flag from Apollo 11? Photos exist of the other flags on the lunar surface taken by the reconnaissance orbiter in 2012. The 5 visible flags are those from the Apollo 12, 13, 15, and 17 missions. It should be noted that no telescope is powerful enough to take photos of the moon's surface in such detail. Therefore, the common man cannot prove the existence of the flags themselves. The only device capable is an orbiter like the reconnaissance. Buzz Aldrin claims that the flag isn't visible because of Apollo 11's liftoff. He claimed that the flag was knocked over by the exhaust. However, photos taken of the Apollo 11 site show no flag at all. Was it completely blown away out into space? Or was there never even a flag on the moon to begin with? Something else is missing. The lunar module didn't leave a blast crater on the surface of the moon when it landed. The answer given to us is that the engines created a lot less thrust than they would on Earth, and so they didn't leave a large crater. But in the world of conspiracy, we're taught to question what we're told. The lunar modules seemingly made no mark on the moon dust, yet footprints could be seen beside them. A very strange inconsistency. More photos in 2009 came from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. These images showed apparent tracks from the Apollo landing site. But if the original film was faked, why couldn't that have been too? At this point, was America just working hard to hide its biggest hoax? And when they didn't take photos of the flag, did they say that it was blown away by exhaust? When Kennedy made his "We choose to go to the moon" speech, technology capable of performing such a feat as walking on the surface of the moon didn't exist. Yet in 8 years, the technology and money needed to make the moon landing happen came through by the skin of its teeth. Some claim that Stanley Kubrick, famous later for his work on The Shining and tons of other movies like A Clockwork Orange, Full Metal Jacket, Dr. Strangelove, and so many more, or Eyes Wide Shut, a movie that, you could write your own script about how Stanley Kubrick had a movie called Eyes Wide Shut, a movie about cults and these weird sex rituals. And it's a really weird movie. It's got like the Illuminati and these sex parties that look exactly like the things I talk about all the time. And then Stanley Kubrick had a full version of the film that he wanted to release, but he ended up dying before the film came out, just a few weeks before it came out. And the people who handled the film afterwards cut a ton of his original footage out. That's a really weird situation. It's really bizarre. It makes you wonder if like some powerful people killed Stanley to remove that footage so that he couldn't expose like some deeper inner secrets of, these rituals and meetings. Stanley obviously was famous for movies like The Shining, and people believe that Stanley filmed the moon landing and made it look real. Using the special effects available, some people claim that Kubrick crafted the set using all of the resources he could have asked for to create a compelling image on film of a man landing on the moon. References were made jokingly in films like Diamonds Are Forever and Capricorn 1 about filming fake planetary landing scenes made to look realistic. Was it a joke or a message? It's interesting. Also, just look at The Shining. This is a very famous theory when it comes to Stanley Kubrick and the moon landing. He's planted a lot of different cues in different movies of his that have some weird lunar and space references. I don't know if this was a tongue-in-cheek joke by Stanley Kubrick, but there's like a direct Apollo NASA reference in the film The Shining, which came out obviously years after the moon landing. So that's up for you to decide. Was Stanley planting those seeds for people to see so that one day they could know the truth? Was he trying to speak to the general public and say, yeah, I did do this? Or is that just him, making a joke out of the whole thing? I don't really know. Another theory suggests that identical backgrounds were used in all the photos taken of the moon landing. with the photos supposedly having been taken miles apart from each other. Some believe that this is evidence of a painted background having been used, but again, debunkers claim that it's because of a lack of atmosphere on the moon, leading to faraway objects not being obscured, and therefore being easily visible from further away. What's more though, is that many people say that there were too many photos taken, up to one photo every 50 seconds. Debunkers say that this claim does not account for two astronauts sharing the workload and simultaneously taking photographs during extravehicular activity. It's weird though, they did take a lot of photographs, and something else that needs to be stated here is just imagine the technology at the time. Most people were still seeing things in black and white. We didn't have cell phones. We didn't have computers. Think of all the technology back in the 1960s and how primitive so much of that technology seems today. And we're supposed to believe, that these men actually landed on the moon using technology from that era, and that none of them died and there were no major accidents or anything like that, and then they didn't return for decades and decades. I'm not telling you what to believe. I'm just bringing up the things that seem fishy and bizarre to me. Yeah. Anyways, I don't want people to think I'm a lunatic after this episode, but this is just more of a fun one that I think is fun, but if it's true, it would be incredibly, deeply disturbing about the level of lies that the United States government would be willing to put out to fake a narrative. But back to these things that people have questioned. Photos also seemingly capture matching C letters on a rock and on the ground, meaning that these things could have been placed there and were labeled because they were studio props. Debunkers state that these are printing imperfections. These are just natural things that occur in photographs that don't appear in the original film. But still, it's incredibly bizarre. One of the most popular theories suggests that the moon landings were filmed high up in the Hollywood Hills, or deep within Area 51. And if you go with a little bit of a reach here, one could say that Area 51, which obviously is associated heavily with space and extraterrestrials, still could possibly house the site of the original filming of the moon landings. Maybe they kept around the studio for posterity, in case they had to go find some old photos and create some new evidence. Who knows what's in Area 51? I certainly don't know. Another question that was asked was this: why haven't we gone back? And the answer that we're given time and time again is that it was too expensive, too dangerous, and it was just unsustainable. They state that once the space race had been won, there was no need to go back to the moon after the Apollo missions were completed. Or perhaps it's because we didn't go in the first place. So what about the actual moon rocks that were brought back to Earth? Scientists say that the hundreds of moon rocks brought back were independently verified. Yet lunar mare basalts, which we're told cover about 17% of the surface of the moon, bear an extremely strong resemblance to Earth basalts. These same rocks account for about 1% of the volume of the Earth's crust. Still, some say that due to the large amounts of meteoric impact that occurred on the moon, the rocks there are composed of slightly different materials, but a fraud may have existed. Curtin University scientist Professor Alexander Nemchin closely observed a supposed moon rock in his laboratory. The rock's composition was like granite. He testified, a very rare rock on the moon, they said, but a rock that's incredibly common on Earth. The rock also contained quartz, and the zircon found in the sample was different from every other rock that was analyzed from the moon. But he had been provided this sample directly from the United States government. The rock was said to have come directly from the moon, and it was supposedly collected by Apollo 14 astronauts in 1971. So how did a rock that looks completely to have been taken just off the ground on Earth, how could that rock have gotten mixed in with rocks that were supposed to have been from the moon? Well, rock exchanges from meteorites, especially 4 billion years ago when the moon was much closer, were blamed. Of course, but it's really just a weird coincidence. This rock from Earth just suddenly ends up in the rocks from the moon, and it's the one that we accidentally gave this guy to analyze. It's totally just a coincidence, But it still begs the question of how many of the other rocks were simply not recognized as Earth samples? How many of the rocks were not looked at as closely? And out of all of the rocks collected, how was this one particular rock found on the surface of the moon? Another question is this: 1% of all meteorites found on Earth are lunar in origin. Were these lunar samples simply taken from our home world without us ever stepping foot off the planet? Or did we manage to send unmanned missions to the moon to collect those samples and return home? Most people who know about the moon landing conspiracy know about all these theories. However, one of the more unknown theories poses questions about the retroreflectors on the moon's surface. Retroreflectors are mirrors used as targets for Earth-based tracking lasers. The presence of these retroreflectors from the Laser Ranging Retroreflector Experiment, or LRRR, provides some evidence that there were indeed landings, but one seems to be missing. Lick Observatory attempted to find Apollo 11's retroreflector as Armstrong and Aldrin were allegedly still on the moon, but they couldn't succeed in finding it until August 1st, 1969. The retroreflectors that were deployed by the other Apollo missions were reportedly detected the same day or within a few days, but it took the team from Lick Observatory longer to detect the retroreflector from the Apollo 11 mission. Could that have been because it was placed there a few days later by an unmanned spacecraft? If the Apollo mission had deployed it the day they arrived on the surface and then first stepped on the moon, why did it take 13 days for the observatory to detect it? Especially when in the future they've been able to detect every other retroreflector almost immediately. What's up with the time gap there? More questions were posed by Mary Bennett and David Percy in their 2001 publication Dark Moon, Apollo and the Whistleblowers, which states that NASA wouldn't risk broadcasting an astronaut meeting an untimely end on live television. This came after the crew of Apollo 1 died in a fire during a test, and the upper management was questioned by the House of Representatives and the Senate. Was only the first moon landing faked, and we managed to make it there by the next missions? Some believe this is so. That's kind of where my belief leans towards. I think there's a high likelihood that the original moon landing was faked in some capacity. I mean, the reasoning for it is there. The space race, a rush to beat the Soviets, American dominance, nationalism, JFK's promise, he's dead. We need to do this and we need to get it done fast before we lose the entire space race to the Soviets. And there's all this weird evidence. I mean, there are a ton of clips that I've seen of some of the footage from the original moon landing mission, and it really does look like the astronauts are floating through space, and then it looks like they get caught on a wire of some sort and swing back and forth like a swing on a playground. Just take a look at the way these astronauts are swinging. I mean, it just does not look realistic. And I don't know if this was just a mistake that happened, if they were live broadcasting this moon landing or what the hell was going on with this, but maybe they overlooked it. It just looks so weird to me. I mean, the guy clearly like swings up and down, and to swing like that, you'd have to have gravity, and to have gravity like that, I don't know. It's just really bizarre. There's so much that doesn't add up here. The original Apollo 11 tapes, in fact, that were recorded by the craft's slow scan television telecast in its raw format telemetry tape at the time of the first moon landing, also seem to have gone missing. Now that seems really important, doesn't it? It seems like you should have the raw footage of humankind's first visit to the moon. You know, like the original Apollo 11 tapes, the very first time a human being in the history of mankind stepped foot on the moon. Think about 1,000 years into the future. There's probably going to be, Walmarts on the moon, and people are going to want to see that original tape. I mean, that's an incredibly important piece of human history, and it's gone. Those tapes were used to record the transmitted data as a backup. Because the low-quality recordings of the landing broadcast remained intact, though, the preservation of the backup tapes was deemed to be unimportant. The tapes were likely erased and reused during a data tape shortage in the early 80s for NASA's Landsat program. Isn't that weird? The footage of the first moon landing, it's erased and essentially taped over for another NASA program. I mean, not even just for the significance of mankind of having those tapes, but those tapes were probably worth, millions, if not billions of dollars for how relevant they are to human history as a whole. And they got taped over. But some people wanted to find those tapes. A retired team from NASA actually tried to find the tapes in the early 2000s, but they were completely unable to do so. These were people that had worked in NASA in the past that knew the ins and outs of the organization, the storage areas, where everything would be, but they couldn't find the tapes. They wanted the rawest footage of the moonwalk, but the tapes were gone. The telemetry tapes were never found. But what they did find were television broadcasting system videotapes and a Super 8 movie film taken of a video monitor in Australia that showed the slow scan television transmission before it was converted. The footage needed to be converted, they said, to be able to broadcast to television screens worldwide. Strange. The blueprints of the lunar roving vehicles were also seemingly destroyed. These blueprints were of the 4 mission-worthy vehicles used in the Apollo missions. The 221-page operation manual contains some drawings, but the blueprints were missing. Once again, why would they destroy the blueprints showing how these vehicles were crafted? Wouldn't that be like incredibly important stuff to hold on to? Once again, not only for mankind, but in case they wanted to go back to the moon, to put into museums one day. Like I said, they're worth millions of dollars. It's like one of the most important documents in human history. The first vehicle that was ever on the moon disappeared. Another theory suggests that the moon landing was filmed in slow motion, and that was the reason why the footage had to be converted for broadcast to television sets. This would have involved shooting the moon landing film at a much higher frame rate, and then slowing it down so that the astronauts appeared to move in low gravity. That's a very, very possible argument. I've shot a ton of footage on film. I know how film cameras work. I work with Super 8 cameras all the time for my other channel, the Paranormal Files, and I could totally see that as being a possibility here. Arguments against this say that there were many hours of supposedly live coverage, and so it couldn't have been sustained. The anti-conspiracy theorists also say that it would have had to have been shot at 3 times the normal frame rate. This is certainly possible though, and it's known as overcranking, which when played back at the normal frame rate, the footage plays back for a longer period of time. All you need is a way to store the frames and then generate new extra frames to slow down the footage. Some say that at the time of the footage, the magnetic disc recorders of the day couldn't have performed this feat, but with the enormous budget put towards the moon landing, it is possible that they had the tech long before the public knew that it existed. I was talking to a very, very intelligent friend of mine who's an investigative journalist the other day, and he was telling me about some information about the technology of the world, and he said something that really resonated with me. He said that the technology that we have access to as the general public today, it's more than likely that the United States government has had that technology for 20 plus years. Like they had cell phones long before they were a public thing. They had telephones long before they were a public thing. They had screens and, computers, and we really have no idea what the government is capable of and what technology they actually have. I mean, if there's technology that the government thinks if they hold on to this will have the one up on everybody else, why are they going to give that out to the general public? It's going to make the government more powerful, and it's going to protect us against our enemies, and it's going to make us, in their eyes, a global superpower, knowing that we have this technology that no one else even knows exists. So is it really that far of a reach to believe that the government could have applied that same type of thinking to the moon landing? Thousands of feet of film would have been needed to be used to slow down the film of the moon landing and then be converted to be shown on TV. But the question is, what lengths were the US government willing to go to so that they could ensure that the moon landing was believable? Well, one of the points made by debunkers about this conspiracy is that out of the thousands of people who would have been involved, no one ever spoke up. But the same can be said about Jeffrey Epstein. The same can be said about the Franklin scandal. The same can be said about Frank Sheldon. The same can be said about any of these that we've talked about. There probably have been people that have spoken up who could have been killed, people that are threatened, people that are told to shut up or they'll lose their jobs, their lives, people that are blackmailed. I mean, there's a lot of ways to keep people quiet. Just look at JFK and John F. Kennedy. Why has no one ever came forward and said this is the exact truth? Well, it's because people were murdered and frightened into staying silent. So that theory of, there's so many people involved, how can they stay quiet? That holds no water with me, because it's just, we know that there are cover-ups and we know that these things do happen. And there is evidence that suggests that some people have tried to expose the truth about this whole thing and were silenced. This is a list of the astronauts and civilians, most of whom were related to the crewed spaceflight programs, who died. Could they have been killed as a part of a cover-up? Theodore Freeman was an American astronaut. He was killed after ejecting from a T-38 supersonic trainer jet, which had suffered a bird strike on Halloween 1964. Elliot C. and Charlie Bassett, selected as astronauts, were killed in a NASA jet crash on February 28, 1966. Edward Givens, selected as a part of the 5th astronaut group, died in a car accident on June 6th, 1967. We know that they use car accidents to assassinate people all the time. We've talked about that on the show, so that one's a little suspicious. Clifton Williams was killed after ejecting from a faulty NASA T-38 trainer jet on October 5th, 1967. He died the same way that Theodore Freeman did. Test pilot Michael J. Adams, a major in the U.S. Air Force, died in an X-15 flight test on November 15th, 1967. Robert Henry Lawrence Jr. was killed in an F-104 plane crash shortly after he was selected as a pilot in the Manned Orbiting Laboratory program on December 8th, 1967. And finally, Thomas Ronald Barron was killed in a car crash on April 27, 1967. Mr. Barron died 6 days after testifying before the House Subcommittee on NASA's oversight hearings following the Apollo 1 fires. So he testified about what he knew, and then he died in a car crash. Like I said, I've talked about before many times, all these people who have had knowledge of these or government conspiracies, they've threatened to talk about it, or if they've been asked to talk about it. In the case of the Apollo bulletin boards, a whole nother story. There was Gina, the woman who was telling the police that she was getting death threats and that these were threatening to kill her. She scheduled an appointment to come into I believe it was the police station, to give her official statement about what she knew about this that she had stumbled upon. And on the way to testify to the police, she got into a car crash, drove high speed directly into a wall, and she died. So car crashes are extremely sketchy to me. But many consider these deaths to simply be accidents. All the deaths happened at least 20 months before Apollo 11. But is it possible that these people knew of the plot and were silenced before they could speak out? For many, this could be a reach, but it's clear how high the stakes were during that time. Because you see, the US was already in a Cold War, a war where all the fighting wasn't necessarily done in the field. The US and Soviet Union were battling to prove their superiority in other ways, and the final objective was getting to the moon. The US and its allies had won World War II not too long ago, but they still felt they were under threat. Americans everywhere feared that the Russians were about to drop the big bomb on them, just as they had done to Japan in the 40s. But this wasn't the only thing that they were dealing with. Along with failing national pride as the country was losing the space race, Americans faced a different conflict that was also rooted in stopping the spread of communism and the Cold War alike, the Vietnam War. The American Patriot Friends Network was quoted as saying in 2009 that putting a man on the moon, or seeming to do so, distracted Americans from the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War. Another theory states that the moon landing was meant to distract from the scandal that would be leaked later on, the Pentagon Papers. Americans all over the country opposed the war, and giving them a distraction in the form of the moon landings may have been just what they needed to keep the public busy, while the government spent millions overseas on an incredibly violent conflict that was killing innocents and soldiers alike. With stakes so high, they couldn't have afforded to fail on the promise that Kennedy made, the promise to put a man on the moon by 1970. And he seemingly, posthumously, made good on that promise just in time, despite the initial sluggish progress made in the United States space program. So the United States suddenly surged forward in incredibly difficult technology, far surpassing what had been done before. They got there just in time, saving America from worldwide embarrassment and shame. And not to mention, the first landing on the moon went relatively well compared to what one would expect. And every single question conspiracy theorists ask seems to have an official answer, but one little detail could result in a bit more credence to the claims. NASA, long after the theories began, seemingly was upset by the work of conspiracy theorists. So in 2002, they granted $15,000 to a man named James Oberg for a commission. James's job was to write a point-by-point rebuttal of all the claims that supported a conspiracy. NASA canceled that project later that year, as many claim that the book only dignified the accusations of a moon landing conspiracy. But James said that he was going to finish the book anyways, and in November of that year, Peter Jennings, a television journalist, said that NASA was so rattled that they spent a few $1,000s trying to refute conspiracy theorists. So why were they so defensive if the landings were real? Could it have just been a project to silence what they saw as hecklers? Or was the institution afraid of these claims making further ground? Did they see a future in which someone finally found a piece of evidence that they just couldn't explain away? NASA and its proponents seem to have a response to every single question asked. But could this simply be because they created the reality that people are questioning? When they hold the reality of the moon landings in their hands, doesn't that mean that they could say anything that matches what they want us to believe? They could even falsify data and information, falsify reports, falsify images, just to go with their theory. These are questions that lie outside of the realm that even most conspiracy theorists would ask. But when something is so highly questioned, how can we be sure? People all over the world ask if man has ever stepped foot beyond the borders of our planet. Some believe that Apollo 11 never made it to the moon, but the later missions were a success. Some believe that no spaceflight has ever successfully landed on the moon. And the biggest question, answered as being a lack of funding, was why? If NASA successfully put men on the moon 6 times, has no other country ever done the same? And why have we never done it since? The manned missions to the moon ended in the 70s. Surely, we would have more to learn about our cosmic neighbor, no? Yet the moon's surface has remained untouched by man, silent and empty since December of 1972. Or perhaps, at the end of the day, that surface has never been touched at all. So everybody, thank you for watching today's episode. That was crazy. I mean, even if you fully believe that we went to the moon and that we landed on the moon, you have to at least question everything for a moment, because this is the perfect conspiracy theory. There's a ton of evidence that refutes the official narrative. There are weird signs hidden in Hollywood movies. There are people that worked in the program that have defected and said that, oh, they had knowledge that this was fake. There's all these inconsistencies in data and reporting, and there's a reason why this conspiracy would have existed. The space race, American dominance, the Vietnam War distraction, and we all know that the government lies to us, so why wouldn't they lie about this? I don't know. I need you guys to comment your thoughts below because I'm eager to hear your personal thoughts and theories on this whole thing. As always, guys, if you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe to the channel. Make sure to like this video and leave me a comment, because those likes and comments help boost the engagement, and it shows YouTube that people are watching and they like these videos. And if you're listening to this podcast, please leave me a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also go do that if you're watching on YouTube. It would really help me a lot. And yeah, as always, everybody, thank you for tuning in. Keep that tinfoil hat on, stay suspicious, and I'll see you next week. Get your sleuth on and download June's Journey today on the Apple App Store or Google Play Store for free. Just scan the QR code on screen and you can dive headfirst into this mystery. Thank you to June's Journey for sponsoring today's video.